giving us some grace as we navigate.
Welcome, everybody, to the Bodacious Brands Podcast. Here is your co-host, Tom Montgomery, along with the... Thank you, Preston. Along with the honorable, the good-looking, the punctual, and the excellent Preston Rutherford. We are two of the four co-founders of a brand called Chubby's Shorts, and we are going to try to come to you on a regular basis to talk about sweet brands, how to build brands, brands we like, lessons we learned, mistakes we made on our path to building a tiny shorts empire. Not a tiny shorts empire, but an empire of tiny shorts. And we hope you find value from it. Without further ado, we're going to get into our first topic, which was an interesting article we came across and figured, why the hell not record a podcast about it? It's an article that comes to us from Tom Roach, who is VP of something at Jellyfish out of the UK. Shout out to Tom Roach. We've been a huge fan of his writing, reading it a lot, trying to think about how it applied to Chubby's, interesting brands it applies to today, and really resonated with a lot of his thinking. This particular article is called "In a World of Change, What Won't?" And really, in it, Tom talks about how the digital marketing landscape has evolved quite a bit, and it's changed. We've got new social media, we've got new tech, we've got VR, we've got AR, we've got AI, we've got everything coming, changing. But in that kind of milieu of change, Tom talks about now what won't change. And I think he centers really on, well, the human brain is a piece of hardware that has evolved over 300 million years. And so that's something that's probably not changing at such a rapid pace. And thus, the way that people receive information, build memory structures, is likely to be very continuous through this whole time period. And so he talks about these kind of 7 immutable laws of effective marketing communication. That's kind of the topic that is really loose. It's kind of a loose framework to give Preston and I some leeway to talk about some of the things we saw at Chubby's, talk about things we're seeing from brands today that we really like. So I'll open it up with a question here, Preston. What did you think was the most kind of interesting thing you read from the article, concept you came across? And we can open it up for some conversation, some lessons learned, some applicability to brands we've built or seen. So have at it.
Thank you, Tom. And I think maybe before we jump in, I know this was mentioned a little bit in the intro, but you'll see that we are holding microphones very close to our mouths. And this is simply to represent that we don't know what we're doing, but we hear that podcasting is all the rage and that sound quality is very important. So because we are recording our first podcast, we found whatever microphone we could get our hands on. And then what we also realized is sometimes we lean back, sometimes we lean forward. And the sound quality would change pretty materially based upon our gyrations. So with that...
As we gyrated more, sound quality went down. I think...
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Increased gyration, decreased sound quality.
Decreased sound quality. And we would like that to be a positive correlation, if at all possible. So with
more
that,
gyration, higher sound quality. That's our outcome. And we're, as you can see, we're innovators in the space. And as you carry your mic around, now the gyration actually, this is called a sound vortex, as you can see for all of the people watching us on video. And it really increases the audio quality through trial.
Why would you wear them when you can hold it?
Yeah, of course.
Well, so Tom, you asked me a great question, which is, which one of these ideas resonated the most? And I think I'd like to start with creativity, and with the idea being that creativity might not be, or excuse me, maybe the strongest driver of sales and profitability over and above things like targeting or any of these other items. And as we've seen, much of the narrative around creativity, like speed, is you either have it or you don't. And I think one of the things that maybe a little bit in this article, but broadly, that we are excited about, passionate about, is to change that narrative a bit. That this, as with anything in life, other subscribers to the growth mindset, this is something that can be improved over time. It is in no way fixed or immutable. And because it's so important, it is, as brand builders, incumbent upon us to start to build that understanding so that we don't ever get into a place where we throw our hands up saying, not for us, can't do it, and therefore have to rely on other tactics, for instance, but that it's something that we all can do. And it's not just a nice to have hand wavy thing. It is, again, something that can be improved over time, something that can be measured. And again, one of the most important things, one of the most beautiful things that relates to brand building. And it's a little bit of a worry that we have looking back on our own experience. We felt very fortunate that it was something that was very foundational to the way we viewed things, but that for a lot of brands and even for ourselves at times, the value of creativity has somewhat diminished in some ways because of how it could be somewhat in conflict or less important than optimizing your click-through rate by 12 basis points or something along those lines that seemingly on a relative basis has gotten more attention and maybe relative importance over time. Potentially, and maybe hot take here, much to the demise of many a brand, many a marketer, many a digital marketer, many a brand builder out there. So let me just pause there. Those are a few initial thoughts in terms of one item that I thought was somewhat interesting, and then some of my supporting thoughts in that realm.
Well, and I think so Preston's calling out. So we've got these 7 immutable laws of effective communication, and one of them that Tom Roach calls out is creativity. The 7, I'll just kind of read through them, and then we can walk through individually.
Yes, that would be
the first
good.
is reach. The second is attention. The third is creativity. The fourth is distinctiveness. The fifth is consistency. The sixth is emotion. And the seventh is motivation. Now, we'll talk to all of these as we go, but Preston called out creativity. And kind of it's interesting because it's in context of distinctiveness and attention, of things that are attention grabbing, things that are distinct. But there's also this notion of creativity that is that je ne sais quoi. And I think it's like one of the kind of hardest to measure of them. And the quote that Tom Roach calls out is a quote that he himself is quoting Faris Jacob, a technology strategist, I suppose, that says, good ideas are non-obvious, non-trivial combinations, which is kind of interesting. And it's kind of like the maybe stand-up comedy bit of this, like these relatable surprises sort of thing, where it's a kind of delightful way of talking about something, or a delightful way of connecting the dots of things that had been passé or everyday, but participating in a new way, or reframing it, or thinking of it in a new way that's surprising and kind of gives you that little spark. But I think like the concept of creativity also goes in line with, number 6 on his list, which is emotion, because when you see something that's really creative, you're oftentimes stricken with an emotion. If there's a really creative, thoughtful joke, you laugh. If there's something that's very creative in the way it kind of tugs at the heartstrings, you feel a certain type of way. And similar to your point, I think like emotion and creativity in marketing, a lot of times take the back seat to the almighty dollar, as people are running their, shopping ads and DPAs and things like this to try and maximize ROAS and platform and sales and these sorts of things. Oftentimes, the kind of really the predominant philosophy that gets reinforced and reinforced and reinforced is show product, talk about features, show price, and those sorts of things. And the unfortunate piece is like that's kind of what works bottom of funnel. If somebody's looking for the best pair of shorts out there and they don't have a brand affiliation, using the Chubby's example, then when they're searching for shorts on the internet, they're probably going to go look at features, price, how does it look, like fashion, things like that, but like at a very product oriented level, which is like, if you're not showing that, then you're not competing. And so the work to be done that is the more creative, delightful work, they're not going to, that's not the moment where they're going to sit down and watch a 30-second or a minute long piece of creative about your business, learn more about why you do, what you care about, have an emotional, heartfelt moment, and then get back to shopping. That's not the time. And in fact, it's like a really low engagement time where they're navigating Facebook and Google and they're just trying to quickly kind of get their job done, as opposed to spend time watching anything for that matter. And so it's an interesting dichotomy of like the room for creativity and emotion is kind of granted by this audience member being in a mindset to receive those things, one, and then two, being in not being super down the funnel to be in like shopping mode, because if they're in shopping mode, they're very likely to be triggered by shopping advertising. I think, the other thing I was going to say is like, the channel really matters. Or advertising on Facebook is really fleeting. The classic way you're advertising on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc., is it's a swipe through. It's like get to the next piece of content. It's not like I'm sitting there watching a TV show or whatever, as the kind of metaphor used to be, and now kind of is with connected TV and things like that, where I'm sitting to watch this for an emotional experience. I'm not flipping through. I'm not hitting the dial. I'm not changing channels. I'm not doing all this stuff. I'm ready to watch something, whether or not like I'm really loving every ad I get shown, I'm at least more engaged and more committed to the experience.
Absolutely. One of the, to your point, to somewhat segue or stay on the emotion idea, one of the goats in this realm is a fellow named Les Binet, and we'll probably go into a lot of his stuff over time, but you're talking about emotion and channel. And one of the things that, as I was recently reading, really stood out was emotion versus message. Message being the thing that appeals to the rational brain that you were sort of talking about. And one of the craziest things that just sort of we've learned about over time is this whole 95-5 idea that, just to put numbers on the point that you were already making, about 95% of people that you're putting your messages in front of, your communications in front of, are in no way looking to purchase from you at this moment. And then when you think about the reality of that, how interesting it is and how enlightening it is that, goodness gracious, this product offer urgency creative or package that is my ad unit really is not doing the job to be done in that scenario, but rather the opportunity that we have and how it is objectively supported by real data. This isn't hand wavy stuff, to appeal to emotion, knowing that it will appeal much more than that heavy DR unit that you're putting in front of 95% of the folks. And in some ways, it's hearkening back to what I'm thinking as it relates to the creative point, which is how the emotional resonance seemingly is, and this is more of my take, because one of the things that was talked about in the creativity section here in this article is the sea of sameness that exists, and how one of the components of creativity is differentiating yourself from, being different enough from, yet related enough from. And you were mentioning that from the comedy perspective, to just be be different, and how the one thought is how the emotional impact could potentially be deadened or lessened. Because I mean, we're in the men's apparel world, have been, and I think we get very heavily targeted by a variety of other men's apparel brands. And I think we can all resonate with the idea that as we scroll any social media application, we effectively see the same ad, the same hook, the same message, the same CTA, the same um, unboxing, paid UGC. There's no semblance of, there is so much sameness there. And that, as I think about it, is maybe one of the things, outside of it just being, hey, this is seemingly the thing that works from a conversion perspective, as you earlier mentioned. The emotional resonance is near zero, because that could be any brand putting out that particular piece of content.
Yeah.
And again, not that this is bad, but I think one of the things that we're calling out is just the general idea that that creative likely works for the 5%. And the opportunity as a brand that we have to explore the space, as it were, around distinctiveness, emotional resonance, creativity, which is something that, when made possible, the the team that you have in place will probably surprise you with the excitement at being able to take some stabs at some of this stuff. And again, none of this stuff changes. I think that's another one of the points that, at least as a part of my journey, has been huge, is a little bit of a humbling experience of, just because we're newfangled digital brand builders, and have access to all of this data, we don't necessarily, or I felt I didn't necessarily need to think about these things that don't change, because I was kind of coming from the perspective that this is a brave new world. We're effectively starting from zero, starting from scratch. None of this old stuff applies. So what I love about this article, and breaking these things down into these 7 components of reach, attention, creativity, distinctiveness, consistency, emotion, and motivation, is that this stuff doesn't change. And these are the things that have been working for centuries. And there's no reason why we can't dive in and learn from them.
Yeah, the creativity one that's really funny is the he has this example of the sea of sameness, and this is like at a moment in time, so it seems like maybe in the 2018 2019 time frame, that there was a very common end line to advertisements that were going on at the time, and the end line was "Find your X," and so he's got the end line of like 27 different ads and campaigns, where all these like find your beach, find your strong, find your greatness, find your fit, find your epic, find your happy, find your freedom, find your own lane, find your dancing feet. And it's funny because I heard it and I was like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. Like you could see somebody hearing that and being like, yeah, let's go with the find your. And it's something that's kind of funny because it probably sounds good to you because you've heard it so much. And it's interesting to think about like creativity and how to recognize. One of the things that I realized as I was kind of reading that is recognizing when you're being in the sea of sameness. Because it's funny because none of these people thought they were in the sea of sameness. And similarly to the ads that he shows up above that are like the mobile, or no, down below that are the mobile phone ads, that are all of these ads that like basically have the same format, and it's just a bunch of creative teams being inspired by each other, which is really funny. And so in that sense, like how to be creative is like an interesting thing. It's like shut yourself out from the world and not get inundated or not get influenced by their ideas. Or if you are, like, be really, really cognizant of it. And I thought this was a really funny take of things that you could totally see brands veering off towards. And even like, some of the most impressive brands in the world, like Apple, the iPhone X, is in this mix of the sea of sameness. It's very funny.
It is. And the funny thing is that, I mean, it happens. It's so easy to have happen to everyone if, given the feedback loop process that exists for the vast majority of creative generation in the DTC landscape is, looking at your competitors, whether it's ads library or otherwise, or looking at what's working for you and then doubling down and doing more of it. It's that feedback loop, because we're all optimizing on the same dependent variable, 7-day last click, 1-day view, ROAS, or whatever it might be, that seems to have a powerful impact on just bringing us all to the, whether it be this sameness or least common denominator. And it can be hard to take that step back and just start.
It's a funny take.
Start to think like,
it's like, this is what works bottom of funnel. Like, if you're selling just like a nameless phone, it's dark background with like blues and purples and like kind of ethereal motifs. That's going to sell phones if they know nothing about your brand.
Angular product shot floating in the sky. Some version of Aurora Borealis. And
Aurora Borealis is a really strong theme in the phone sales game. That is really funny. I wonder, that's a hot take, that it's because no one has a brand that everything looks the same. I guess that's kind of what we're saying, but everyone iterates towards the exact same outcomes, even as they're trying to present really cool, awesome, pretty homepages, which is, again, in a world of change, what won't? Apparently people really like the ethereal Aurora Borealis motifs. The other one that I thought was an interesting call out was reach, right? Like, I never, at Chubby's, we like never thought about how many impressions did we serve. But I think a slightly different take on this. So he has a funny note in this that's from this guy, Martin Weigel, apparently, who seems like a smart guy. I've never heard of him. But side note, it's kind of funny because we're these like modern digital marketing people who are like, it feels like we're finally getting in touch with like the old guard of marketing or like traditional marketing and like the people who've been doing this for a long time. And we're like, man, they're really smart. It's part of growing up. But this guy, Martin Weigel, says, your brand's health depends on lots of people who don't know you well, don't think of you very much, and don't buy you often, if at all. And that's a hot take. It's kind of very much in the Ehrenberg Bass sort of marketing philosophy of the way you grow is expanding new customer acquisition, and that's it. The stuff that does that will also increase your loyalty. But you're talking about getting a person who buys you 0.3 times a year to buy you 0.4 times a year. And the way to do that is just all through better reach and better expansion.
Right.
But it's interesting because the balance of that is you can buy reach pretty easily. You can go run reach campaigns on whatever platform you care about. And clearly that's not what a lot of us are doing, because I think importantly, like, it's 1 through 7 that all have to be present in your marketing, not just getting a lot of people to register an impression, whether or not they actually see it. But I thought this was an interesting one.
100%, which is what I think is so applicable to this moment right now, is this sentence here, just the broad idea that with macro headwinds, we aim to still hit or comp top line numbers. And because we're seeing new customer acquisition headwinds or trying to cut spend, we end up potentially over harvesting our existing customer base. And I like how this is said. marketer not believing this and thinking they can grow their brand primarily by driving loyalty from existing heavy customers is like a physicist not believing in gravity. When I hear that, I'm like, holy shit! I was
Well,
not even a physicist, but it was me not even believing in gravity. And
well, I think what's funny is like this may be where just having really deep data on your customers comes into slight, not necessarily disagreement, but like we saw growth at Chubby's by doing things with our retention
right,
audience. Now, like we weren't doing that through advertising. We weren't advertising to our repeat
right,
customers, but we were thinking about like, okay, how do we drive a better and better repeat rate? And we did have some wins there. We like definitely had some wins that grew repeat rate materially. Not necessarily through an advertising perspective, but obviously there's massive differences in product experience, but also your post-purchase experience and things like that. And I wonder if this is where some of the new guard can kind of supplement a bit. Is we definitely saw profit growth and business growth as we worked on those retention funnels, but it wasn't through like a traditional advertising marketing sort of perspective. It was a bit
yeah,
broader.
yeah. One of the things we might just call out, maybe as like a not necessarily disclaimer and or caveat, is the a lot of these folks are speaking about a certain type of brands, whether they're maybe mass brands available mostly through retail, maybe broad, general um, CPG brands. So while the whole focus of this conversation is things that won't change, there is the filter that we as brand builders have to run any of this information through. And a perfect example of that is the specific example, Tom, that you just gave, which is yes, maybe in general, I get it that reach penetration is another thing that Byron Sharp at Aaron Blue Bass talks a bit about, Les Binet as well. Just getting more customers, in their opinion, is the best way to drive more loyalty. Yes, but then there's the other components as well. Um, and honestly, maybe part of it is that they aren't operators, or what it could be is just that the data that they have, and this is maybe to the double-edged sword of the data we have, it allows, maybe it's just harder to get that repeat purchase data. I mean, I guess you might get it
Yeah.
from panel data if you're like a Coke or something like that, or a Dove. Um, but yeah, maybe a nuance to maybe not taking all of this at face value, and just um, these are just some of the interesting themes that we're exploring together.
Well, and it's certainly the case that like if you're hitting on all of these, the more people that you expose it to, the better, right? Like generally, and there's a
Right,
price to pay. But the other guy who had a little bit of a bone to pick with Aaron Brook Bass, again, only slightly. Like these are all on the margin. This
right,
isn't you should only focus on new or only focus on repeat. It's like okay, how much and what sorts of things should you be doing? Was Jared Schreiber of Breakout Brands. And he has a slightly different take. He's like, yes, generally I agree with Aaron Berg Bass and Byron Sharp. However, in this particular case, loyalty and retention are really important. And the difference of numerator is numerators looking at like they have a panel of people who are sending their receipts to them. And so they can track an individual purchaser's behavior over time in a slightly different way. And I don't know all the data sources for Aaron Berg Bass, but this was a distinction that Schreiber called out in the book. And so I'm just taking him at face value of we're able to see consecutive. And so the caveat he had is like, yeah, it's not necessarily just all repeat, but if you can get a customer to one of the things that they did see associated with breakout brands was that disproportionately for those brands, the next opportunity that a customer had to purchase in their category, if they went back to that brand, that's a really good sign. And so in Chubby's world, it would be like the next opportunity they have to buy shorts or swim trunks, they come back to Chubby's. Cool. That's really good. If it's just that they repeat it at some point in time, that's not as indicative as the consecutive in category purchase. So that was interesting, and maybe like a good signifier of building a memory structure there, of like and building an affinity structure there, of just like the cognitive dissonance of like having bought like twice in a row, such an awesome experience. I'm going to buy the next one. Right, you're obviously a lot more invested in that business than if you then they bought a Chubby's pair of swim trunks, and then they bought, I don't know, a Hurley pair of board shorts or whatever. You can see how like that's just not as reinforcing, and so like it makes a ton of sense. But he had a slightly different take, based on the data that he pulled, which was from the numerator data set. And so I do think like what data set you're looking at, what sorts of businesses you're looking at, certainly matter. But it's interesting that there's some dissent, broadly, on the fineries of it. Taking a step back, of course, like if you've got a great message that resonates with lots of people, you're doing something really, really good.
It's something I just wanted to get your take on, and what I think is kind of cool, maybe even just for a prompt for folks listening, or a way to think about approaching it, is again in the creativity section, the von Restorff effect, where when multiple similar things are presented, the one that differs most is more likely to be remembered. So this harkens a bit back to the sea of sameness, but just from a visual perspective, getting attention. But a lot of what we talk about here is building these memory structures, which maybe that's a fancy way of just saying getting more people to remember you, having a higher quality memory, to where there's a higher probability that when they are actually wanting to buy some tiny shorts, they automatically think of Chubbies. And Ehrenberg Bass talks about it as mental availability. But from the tactics, so then moving back, if you're a marketer and you're thinking to yourself, well, how the heck do I do that? It's, I think, fun to have this be a little bit of a prompt for coming up with some ideas for things that you can do, putting a name on it. My VR effect, or how's your von Restorff today, team? Let's push ourselves to up the von Restorff here. But just sort of thinking about, okay, team, we're going to come up with something here. Let's just be different. And it's so hard when you're, in that daily grind of eking out, a slight increase in ROAS, or click-through rate, or even, contribution as measured on a sort of short-term attribution basis. It's just so fun to be able to kind of step back and think about, not that you can't apply this general idea to what you're doing on the short term, let's call it activation or conversion side. Certainly can. I don't know why not. It's kind of like a good prompt across the board. But being able to really take a step back and think about how this could potentially apply to your brand, I think the ability to really explore the space can start to happen when you are starting to think about, okay, let's go for that broad reach. Let's go far and wide, and couple that with maximizing our Van Restorff effect could really lead to some interesting results. So just trying to think about, and maybe that's a little bit of what we do for the last 15 minutes here, is start to maybe take some of these ideas and maybe link them to either Chubby stories. I don't know whether it be mistakes we made or just recommendations for how listeners or folks who are maybe following some of the stuff that we're doing, how they can maybe tactically or strategically incorporate some of this stuff into their day-to-day for driving the most killer 2024 imaginable.
Yeah. Well, I thought what was interesting is like the von Restorff effect, positing like for memorability, just being different is important. So then like, what's your industry's sea of sameness? Like what's your market's sea of sameness? What's like the common thread there? Is an interesting one. And really understanding that, just so you can zig while others are zagging, really cool, and something that we probably didn't do as good of a job of at Chubby's as we could have. Just being really on top of how it's evolving, and not just from when we started, because I think when we started it, we had a lot more focus on that. But like every year, what's the new sea of sameness? What's the new kind of trend du jour? Is there like a really cool one that is implementable? The other thing is like the von Restorff effect might orient you towards difference for the sake of difference, right?
Yep.
Like just being insane and just like having something wild that's just different and not interesting, right? Like not creatively different, not and so I think the other note that Tom Roach, the author, calls out is the von Restorff effect won't work. It works to get attention. It won't work if the object of attention is not relevant or motivating. And so I think there is this aspect of creativity isn't just difference. It's this kind of delightful, surprising difference that's also relevant, which is like, again, it's like really hard. But where you start is, I would need to be different from the sea of sameness, and I know kind of my customers' needs, you're probably able to iterate in a really interesting way. The other one, like in this lineup of the 7 principles, you've got attention, creativity, and distinctiveness all in a ring. And for my part, like a little bit hard to digest all the differences among those, particularly attention and distinctiveness, right? Like being distinct grasps attention. So reading through the text is like really important here, where the distinctiveness seems like more distinctive assets. That is not just as this piece of creative have to stand out and have to grasp attention, but we also need to give them something to build a memory structure around, and that thing needs to be distinctive. So not just the creative, but the golden arches of McDonald's. That's a distinctive asset that now I can associate with this piece of creative. And so it's these kind of assets that build memory structures, that are the things that build memory structures on top of. And one of the funny things that's like the Ehrenberg Bass note is like iconography and characters and things like that are like really powerful. Like Tony the Tiger is an icon that is a distinctive icon for Frosted Flakes, right? And okay, great. Now you see a tiger, you think Frosted Flakes. Like that's a really great association. And so thinking about your iconography, thinking about what are these assets you're helping people latch onto is a really fun exercise. But it's also like, is the move that everybody should have a little character, a little like mascot? Is it? Yeah, tactically, it's kind of a funny thing to think through.
What was prompted in my mind when you started talking about tying to not different for difference's sake, and something we haven't necessarily covered yet in this conversation is motivation. And it's this idea that motivation is aided by including something that reinforces what the brand helps you to achieve. And then this last sentence, the emotion evoked by a piece of communication and the implicit goal it promises to help people achieve can be quite different things. So the nuance around emotion, and then even the applicability to creativity, where an essential component here that is important for us not to forget is, this whole idea that what can you achieve? What can the viewer achieve? What can this, whether it be an ideal state of life, how we're making the world better for the viewer, for the person experiencing our stuff. I thought it was kind of cool. And it helps to maybe, I guess all of these things can be viewed as, stabilizing foundations, but this one being maybe one of them, as, hey, what are we putting out there, and does it actually tie to this idea of what people can achieve here, as maybe even being seen as like a usefulness of the creativity, a usefulness of the emotional drive that we've incorporated into a piece of creative. That was something that I thought was kind of interesting about motivation.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think like I wonder. It seems like there's like two vectors. There's like the emotional affect, and then the what's this category? What's the job to be done? Sort of affect of what you're working on. And I wonder if it's like finding the white space across both of those that's like the secret sauce.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is it's easy for us to think about like the jobs to be done sort of white space,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like, how does this fit into your life? I'm going to try and think of a unique way that I can approach the market. And so if I'm selling phones, I'm going to think of a unique way that I'm satisfying a unique need that I'm not seeing elsewhere in the market. But an emotional white space is kind of also an interesting idea, where in the insurance world, everyone's approaching insurance through the lens of humor. And maybe that's because it's really successful. Like you've got Geico, you've got Progressive, you've got State Farm. There's like generally the orientation is the emotional response I want is for you to laugh. And that's going to be memorable for you. I wonder if there's like an emotional white space in the really dramatic, and maybe this is because it's insurance. It's like kind of a depressing concept already. And so that's why they stay away from it. But I wonder if there are these notions of emotional white space in a category where it's, yeah, like your job to be done, particularly in insurance, but is like relatively standard. But the way you connect the emotional affect, is there a way to play in that, in hitting on the different emotion that's not humor, it's nostalgia, it's romantic love, it's drama, it's whatever. I wonder if that's a concept that is useful to find not just the job to be done white space, but the emotional white space in your category.
Right. Right. So as we think about these 7, let's call them unchanging principles of effective marketing communication, and the general idea that our brain is this unchanging piece of communications hardware, how do we think about how our listeners, our followers, whoever, just other brand builders can start to think about, okay, it's Friday, I'm listening to this. On Monday, I'm showing up, I'm finalizing my Q1 plans, or I'm thinking about what I'm doing to kick off January. What can I do with this stuff?
Yeah. I'll speak through the lens of like how I'm currently thinking about it. If I'm running a brand, here are the things that I would be doing. Which that's the way I'm thinking about it right
Yep.
now. Is one, I'm doing research on my category, my competition, other people in the category, both in big box and online. What are people seeing in the category that I'm in, broadly? What's the sea of sameness? Is there a sea of sameness? What's the emotional space that people are occupying? Where are people finding a lot of success, and where are people faltering? Looking at all of the ad creative on whatever places I can find on Meta, obviously, and then across the board, like finding the creative that's running, checking out all the sites, and like starting to build that notion. And then finding these kind of distinctive notes, both from a like visual perspective, from a emotional perspective, and from a jobs to be done perspective. Those are kind of like, seems like the 3 big vectors to play around with. And basically drop that off with a creative team or myself and start to write treatments for these things, and like come up with 50 ideas that hit on this concept, and 50 more with a creative team, and start to winnow away at those concepts that hit the most on those ideas, and then that are also the most distinct from one another, so that you yourself aren't just taking a single shot. You're taking a few different shots at how to kind of escape the sea of sameness. And then get out and record a V1 of these things, start to play around with these concepts in a very like almost like agile product management approach of what's the minimum viable product that hits this note that you can do in a couple of days and get an edit up, if it's video content, or that you can knock out from a graphic design perspective. So how can you start to test these and feather these content pieces out, get an early read on limited distribution of which of these concepts are the most powerful and the most distinct, and then scale. And if you feel like production value needs to go up on the next rev, whatever, like iterate your product from there. But realizing the product is a campaign that ideally lasts for at least a year or a few months, that you can kind of hit and can be that distinctive asset for a long amount of time. So that's like a quick rundown of how I would do it from like a creative perspective. What about you? What do you think?
Well, I think one thing that is, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of someone who's, we're recording on December 1, we just finished Black Friday, Cyber Monday. We're probably moving into the end of the year, maybe trying to push gift cards or whatever it might be. Once we get closer to Christmas and shipping deadlines get harder to hit. And also just thinking about kicking off January with a bang, it's everything you said around the creative side of things. And I think it's also, and this is like a broad theme that we'll continue to talk about, but it's okay, how do I then, once I've taken these shots on goal and I've done it extremely quickly, in the probably the lowest production value way possible, how do I start to, place and or size investments? Like how do we start to think about how we're actually going to translate this to, running this media? And, at the very least, the way we can start to think about it is just running this stuff organically, right? I mean, it's, especially if you've got a bunch of shots on goal, I think that's one of the benefits of a bunch of shots on goal, and coming up to the extent possible with as much of a machine as you possibly can, where, I mean, I think this is, just as a quick aside, this is one of the learnings that we took away was, production value, at least for us, was in many ways inversely related to the success of the piece of content. So in a lot of ways, some of the notes that we can give are, if you look at this from a complete blank slate and look at what is most consistent with the stuff you organically engage with, it doesn't necessarily have to be $50K that you drop with an agency to just explore this idea. And in a big way, it can just be, to your point, Tom, just walking out of the, or you don't even have to walk out of the office, just start filming at your desk and see if you can explore some of these concepts, and just try to put it out there and see what happens, start to learn. That seems like, from a tactical perspective, translating it to actual content that you'll put out there, a great way to start. And then I think, rubber meets the road in some ways, where you start to think about putting dollars behind it and how you're going to measure the effectiveness of a lot of this stuff, which is an area that we've learned a lot about for sure, and I'm excited to talk about more in the future. But maybe that's part two, is just, okay, from a creative perspective, I have some of these pieces. I'm starting to take shots on goal. Now what? So there's some thoughts there, but this was fun.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, very fun. Hopefully, any listeners who are listening to this final product found some value. Tom Roach, thanks. Maybe we'll try and get you on our burgeoning podcast. Bring some of your street cred to this thing. Yeah, I love the idea of digging into kind of the now what of, okay, we've got creative, and how do I tell if it's hitting? How do I tell where I should put my dollars? Should I put dollars there, et cetera?
Yeah.
So I think that's a great topic.
And my feeling is, I'll just stop it. My feeling is that